I was 20 years old when I started out on this Wanderyar. And I had these friends who lived in South Africa, and they were extremely rich, and they were very fond of me, and I of them. Down to South Africa. They invited me to visit them at Christmas time. So I went to South Africa, and that was my introduction to Africa. And so that is how I found myself eventually in Zanzibar. When I hitchhiked up through Africa, I went to Zanzibar, and Zanzibar was an exotic, colorful island, full of interesting people, and underneath it all seethed this hatred between the Arabs and the Africans, and the British were in the position of being the protectors of Zanzibar. It was a British protectorate, but the British were going to leave at the end of that year. And that was in I was there first in 1963. And so I met one of the revolutionary leaders when I got to Zanzibar. He'd just been let out of prison. His name was Babu. And he took me around and showed me what it was like for the Africans on the plantations and how they were really enslaved. And he had spent a lot of time in Red China. Now, China, to me, had a very close personal association, as I've told you, because of my father. But also, I was excited because Red China was also absolutely off limits to Americans. And he was on the other side, and he was a revolutionary, and I was revolutionary in spirit at that time. We knew very little about China. As a result, if you knew somebody who had lived or been to China, you were somehow able to go into China yourself in your mind, and it was something that other people didn't know about. So it was a fascinating experience to talk to Babu and to learn about his experiences in China and to understand what was wrong on Zanzibar and why he wanted to change things. First of all, China was almost in my blood because all during the period when I was growing up, my father was, certainly when I was very young, my father was in China. And his closest friends, two of whom became godfathers of mine, were also people who had lived in China and had lived adventurous lives, particularly one of them, Graham Peck, the author of Two Kinds of Time. He was a wonderful, offbeat person my father had known in China. He too had gone to Yale. He wrote a book called Through China's Wall, which was a wonderful book about his travels in China when he was in his 20s, right after he'd gotten out of Yale. He had done what I was doing in Africa, which was traveling around, seeing things, meeting people, and living on his own. And so my father was, of course, as usual, very prescient, very forward-looking when he made him my godfather, because he understood something about my own spirit. And so I heard a lot about China that way from my father, but I was fascinated by China, and when I was in boarding school, in history classes, and I read the newspaper every day, we talked about communist China. It was a period when if you were well educated and you went to a good school and you read the newspaper, you knew what was going on, and you knew about John Foster Dulles and his policies about China and how he refused to shake hands with Zhou Enlai, and you knew about how Mao had to sort of cut China off from the world. You knew about paper tigers, you knew about fellow travelers. All of this was part of my vocabulary. So I felt very connected to China in many ways. And I would see old China hands when I came to New York with my father, because he always liked to eat at Chinese restaurants with his old colleagues who had been in China with him. So when I was there on Zanzibar, I felt that I was in tune with something that my father had done, and with that whole idea of adventure that my godfather had experienced. And I was somehow in the tradition that I had known about when I was growing up, of people who went to a remote place, met interesting people. But of course I was still very, very young. I wasn't even 20, well, I was 21 at that point. I had just turned 21. And I stayed on Zanzibar for quite a while, for maybe a month, when my stepfather died, the man I've told you about who went to Paris and whom I loved when I was growing up, the tennis professional. And it was the first real death in my family, and I was very shocked by that. So I went back to California to be with my family. But I realized that I wanted to return to Zanzibar. Right away I understood I really have to go back to East Africa. That is where my life will take on some kind of meaning, because I was lost still. I was a boy who had flunked out of college. I wanted to write, but I still hadn't had enough experience. And so I went to my father, who was living at that time in Connecticut, writing about his boyhood there. And I asked my father to help me, and he was in despair because he didn't know what was going to become of me. He thought, oh, why doesn't he do something that really makes sense? Why don't you become an architect, he used to say to me. Last thing in the world I wanted to do was to be an architect. So I wanted to write short stories, but at the same time I also wanted to go out into the world and find my way. So he helped me. He arranged. I arrived in East Africa just after independence from the British had been declared. So that was in 1963, December, and by the 1st of January 1964, I was on my way to Zanzibar in the Indian Ocean, which was off the coast of Tanganyika and Kenya. And I had witnessed something of revolution on my way up the Nile, and I had had these interesting experiences. And meanwhile, there had been trouble in the Congo, there had been revolution in the Congo, and so revolution was boiling up all over the place in Africa. And it was a very important part of the world then. And particularly now that the British had given independence to these countries, people were wondering what was going to happen to them. And I went to Zanzibar without really sort of knowing what I was getting myself into or what I was doing. I was just there. Suddenly I found myself there, and it was very, very hot. Absolutely torpid the way it had been, but no rains the way it had been when I was there in April. But I just resumed my life there. I lived in the guest house of an Arab named Salim Bourwani, who was a very educated man. There were some other people staying there. And I used to go off to the Zanzibar Hotel for drinks, lunchtime, and then I'd talk to people there and I'd get to know them. Well, one morning I woke up and revolution had suddenly broken out on the island. What happened was that although there was a great deal of discord on the island in the new government between the Arabs and the Africans, and there were different parties, and revolution was sort of under the surface. My friend Babu had been in jail and had somehow gotten out and was over on the mainland, so I hadn't seen him. I don't think that revolution was planned by anybody on the island at that point, but this man who called himself a field marshal, named John Okello, came over with a militia on the eve of Ramadan, and that was the 14th of January, 1964, snuck onto the island in the dark when all the Arabs had gotten drunk and gone to bed after eating a great deal and celebrating, and they stormed up the island and they broke into the arsenal and they got all the weapons in the arsenal and they handed them out to all these Africans who worked on the plantations, who hated the Arabs. And they had then an army of Africans, and they stormed up and they grabbed the radio station, they took over the airport, and suddenly, when I woke up that morning, revolution had broken out. And Salim Bourwani, my host, the man whose guest house I was staying in, gave me a gun. He said, they're going to take me away, and they're going to kill me.
Because he's Arab.
Because I am an Arab. Of course they're going to take me away. I know this. I have accepted it. It is my fate. But here, you must protect yourself. Keep this gun in case you need it. Of course, I'd never used a gun before, and I quickly put it into a drawer, a bottom drawer of my bureau in my room, never looked at it again. Suddenly I realized I'm the only reporter on Zanzibar. I'm the only foreign journalist on Zanzibar. Now what do I do?
When you were 21 years
I was
old.
21 years old. I'd never been a journalist.
But you remember what Mr. Shang told you to do.
Yes, and the New York Herald Tribune foreign editor. But I'd never been a journalist. I'd never written for a newspaper. And I wasn't terribly interested in writing for newspapers, I must say, since I considered myself a fiction writer.
You just want to write a novel.
Yes, I wanted to write a novel. I wanted to write short stories. And so here was this situation, and I was the only foreign correspondent on the island, and I didn't even know how to type.
You didn't have a typewriter?
I didn't have a typewriter, no. And I always write longhand anyway. I prefer it. But I eventually joined other Americans after being on that island for that day and the next. And I decided that I had to file a story, so I went on the Americans sent this destroyer over to take American citizens and anybody else who wanted to leave the island, including some Arabs who wanted to get off the island, which was very wise of them. Also, people who worked on Project Mercury, which was an American satellite system that had been set up on Zanzibar. They too had to leave the island because they were considered CIA people. So off we all went to Dar es Salaam, and there this journalist I knew named Jack Nugent met me at the pier, and
Newsweek.
he was the Newsweek correspondent, and he said, Peter, I'm over here, come with me. So off I went with him, and I got him to help me write a story, which I then took down to the Cable and Wireless office and sent to New York, and then decided with him to go back to Zanzibar. And there were other journalists who wanted to go back too, and one was the Time correspondent, who became my lifelong friend, Bill Smith, the New York Times correspondent, Bob Conley. There was a British correspondent named Claude Sanger who worked for the Manchester Guardian. There were other people, all these people. There were 7 of us all together who eventually went back. Now, meanwhile, other correspondents, Russians, Chinese, the Polish writer Ryszard Kapuscinski, for example, who came from, of course, a Soviet bloc country, and also the Fleet Street boys, who were very good at getting themselves anywhere. They'd all gotten onto Zanzibar somehow, probably mostly by flying in before it was too late. We didn't know, but discovered was that there was a massive slaughter of Arabs taking place out on the plantations and in the countryside. We went over on a hired boat, 7 of us, and we asked permission to go ashore. They denied us permission. The government, the new revolutionary government, had been formed. But we went ashore anyway, and we were put under semi-house arrest. And you can see already in about 3 days, since the whole thing had started, since I had left, had become chaotic. And there were Africans everywhere wearing, crazy costumes. They were in a state of jubilation. There was tremendous amount of drinking. Everybody had guns. It was actually terrifying. But we went ashore. We were put under house arrest at the Zanzibar Hotel. And that's when I discovered that my friend Babu was back on the island, and he had been made the new Minister for External Affairs.
An important man.
So he'd become very important. And I escaped from the semi-house arrest to go and see him. I thought, now I have a scoop. I will be really a great... The scoop was that I went to Babu's house, and Babu greeted me. And we went up to his rooftop. Now remember, it was about 95 degrees, possibly 100 degrees. We were sitting in the sun. He brings out a bottle of White Horse Scotch, pours me a glass, no ice. I start drinking it. And I asked him about the revolution, and he told me he had no idea that revolution was going to break out, which I believe was completely true, because this man, this crazy field marshal, had come out of nowhere. Nobody knew who he was. Turned out he was a member of the military from Uganda. Well, Babu, however, was an important figure politically on Zanzibar, and so he became part of the government. But then I said, well, Babu, they're killing Arabs, aren't they? And he said, no, they're not. And I said, yes, they are. Don't you think they are? They must be killing Arabs out there. They're slaughtering them, aren't they? He said, no, have another drink. So we talked back and forth like this for a while. I couldn't sort of convince him that he ought to just tell me what was going on. Then we got into his car, and we were going back to the hotel because he had to go to a cabinet meeting and he was going to drop me off at the hotel. I heard one of the guards say to him in the car, in Swahili, this is one of the CIA guys we arrested when they landed on the island this morning.
He was talking about you.
And he was talking about me, and Babu's, I remember his foot on the accelerator because he was wearing flip-flops. I remember sort of long bony toes on this accelerator, suddenly pushing the accelerator forward. Suddenly we were going much faster. And he got me to the hotel and he said, okay, see you later. And he really meant it. He planned to get together again. But then he went to a revolutionary meeting. I was quite drunk by this time because I had all this scotch. So I went upstairs. While I was upstairs, the entire revolutionary cabinet came into the hotel where the American charge d'affaires was having a discussion with some reporters. And they marched him out at gunpoint. And they put us all under complete arrest. And we thought we were in real trouble. And we were under a guard who'd been trained in Cuba, who carried what was a stem gun, really big rifle, automatic rifle. It was dangerous. And the other reporters wouldn't speak to us. The 7 reporters who would come to the island were under complete house arrest. And then we began to hear things on the radio that were not so good. And we thought, what's going to happen? Well, the next morning, they said, well, you're the one they're going to take out and shoot, because you're the one who went and talked to Babu. You're the spy. You're the one they think is a CIA spy. And I said, but I'm not. And they said, well, that's what they think, so you're the one they're going to get. Well, so from that moment on, I was completely terrified. And none of the other journalists now would speak to me because they felt that I had endangered their lives, and I felt very, very guilty about that. But my friend Bill Smith, who remained a lifelong friend, became my best man at my wedding, and we knew each other very well. We drove over Africa together. We spent many, many times traveling. He was the Time correspondent. He was my friend, and he said, don't worry. I was up there in my room, going out of my mind, truly in an existential state of mind where I could see the world without me. I was dead and the world was going on, and I could sort of imagine this. And he said, no, nothing's going to happen. Don't worry, just hang on. Well, later that day, we were taken off the island. First, they took us to the cemetery to show us the freshly dug graves, and they said, we just wanted you to see how peaceful it is here. When we got off the island finally, which we did, we went on a British survey ship back to Mombasa. Of course, we were all in a different mood by then, because we all felt liberated. And it turned out that we had made the headlines all over the world as these people who had been arrested on Zanzibar.
What was the headline?
I can't remember the headlines now. In fact, I'm not sure I ever saw a headline, but it was something to the effect of U.S. journalists arrested in revolution on Zanzibar, or something like that. Well, when I got back to Dar es Salaam, there were telegrams from my father and from Mr. Sean and from the foreign editor of the Herald Tribune, all congratulating me. Of course, I didn't feel I deserved any congratulations. I felt that I had perhaps seriously endangered my new colleagues, but I also felt different. I was a different person because of this experience. I didn't perhaps realize quite how different my life was going to be, but I changed somewhat at that stage, and I became a person who had a sort of sense of what it means to be a professional. That was the experience that changed my life, because out of that experience I realized that I could be a writer and I had gone through something. It was a rite of passage. So subsequently, I wrote my first novel, and it was published when I was 27 by Doubleday, and it was called Firestorm.
Work of fiction.
And work of art. And so my ambition was achieved. I created this work, which I think is of lasting value and was very well received and began my literary reputation.